I'm actually going to start and welcome everyone who's come in from the waiting room. My name is Larissa Sembelik-Chaladin. I'm the director of the Kule Folklore Center and also the Kule Chair of Ukrainian Ethnography here at the University of Alberta. And today it is our first folklore lunch for the semester, for the fall 2024 semester. We usually host one per month throughout the school year on various topics related to Ukrainian folklore. And today we are welcoming Winter Greet from Melbourne, Australia. Winter is third generation with Eastern European background. It was her grandfather who came to Australia, and she will be presenting to us on the topic of Vyshyvanka spirit, and she likes to credit and thank Dr. Yana Ostapenko from the Association of Ukrainians in Australia for suggesting Vyshyvanka for her research topic. She completed a BA with honors in history in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne in 2022. And is now in her second year of a master's in arts program in cultural management that is concurrent with a diploma in languages. Today's presentation is based on her research and the paper that she wrote for her honors thesis. And the thesis was titled Spiritual Armor, Crafting Ukrainian Identity Through Vyshyvanka. And I'm just going to share with everyone in the chat a link to that paper. I want to congratulate her on receiving her first class honors for her in-depth look at the symbolism behind embroidery that so many of us are familiar with. Just a little bit more in her paper. Winter wrote, the brightly colored and delicately detailed Vyshyvanka, the traditional Ukrainian embroidered shirt, has long been a marker of Ukrainian ethnic and cultural identity. And she was motivated to explore contemporary context of Vyshyvanka and the explosion of digital images featuring Vyshyvanka circulating since the Euromaidan in 2013-14, and on the history of the creation of World Vyshyvanka Day, which has been celebrated now for over 10 years. Also, Vyshyvanka serves as a vehicle for mobilizing solidarity with Ukraine internationally, particularly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So with that, I'd like to welcome Greet for joining us here in Canada. I understand it's 4 in the morning there for you. And thank you for making time to join us. And I'm going to turn it over to you to share with us what you've got. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Larissa, for such a lovely introduction. I'll just share, making sure I'm sharing the right screens. You all here? And perfect. So I believe that should be there now. So really, thank you very much to all of you and for the invitation to come and speak here. So I'm truly honoured, and especially considering but so much of my understanding of Ukrainian ethnography has come from amazing researchers from Canada. So truly amazing. So I would also just firstly like to acknowledge all of the support from my wonderful supervisor, Associate Professor Julie Fedor, also to Dr. Yana Ostapenko from the Association of Ukrainians in Victoria, Deanna Ramsey from the Ada Booth Slavic Collection at Monash University, and Marcia Rochki from the Ukrainian Museum of Australia. So for all of their support and assistance. So thank you all for coming. So what I would like to do in this talk is to share with you some of the work that I've done, looking into the developments of Vyshyvanka and its role in the current conflict. I'd also be grateful for any feedback and comments. So first and foremost, starting off on May 16, 2024, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posted on Twitter, now X, an eloquent tribute to Vyshyvanka. So today is Vyshyvanka Day, celebrating the traditional Ukrainian embroidered shirt. Visible or invisible, he wrote, it is always under a defender's pixel, a rescuer's uniform, a medic's coat, a power engineer's jacket, a volunteer, a teacher, or anyone who holds the defense. Our children have known it since infancy. It represents the unity of all generations of Ukrainians over the centuries. Its pattern is unique because it is embroidered by our own actions on a canvas of our values. Over the years of our resistance to aggression, it has become an informal uniform for all those who defend humanity, freedom, and the right to self-identify, identity. Happy Vyshyvanka Day to Ukraine, all Ukrainians, and Ukraine's friends around the world. So accompanying the post, as you can see here, was a picture of Zelensky and his wife Elena posed in complementary black and white Vyshyvanki, a departure from Zelensky's usual khaki-toned embroidery. The contrast of colour, sombre yet steadfast. Since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, Vyshyvanki have become an instantly and universally recognisable feature of Ukrainian identity and resilience. Striking in their appearance, the embroidered shirts have also become an identifiable marker of support for Ukrainian sovereignty. So let me quickly go through some of the basics. I know that these will be familiar to many of you, so bear with me. So the word Vyshyvanka generally translates to embroidery and is found on numerous kinds of traditional household Ukrainian items, including ceremonial cloths, the rushnik, pillowcases, and tapestries. In common usage, however, Vyshyvanka has come to refer to the embroidered shirts originally worn by the Ukrainian peasantry. The work of embroidering Vyshyvanki is traditionally the domain of Ukrainian women who created Vyshyvanki for significant life events such as the birth of a child, the death of a loved one, or marriage, for which they embroidered their own and their future husbands' Vyshyvanka. So the process of embroidering with feminine motherly love combined with specific motifs was believed to protect members of the family from harm. Further, Vyshyvanka are unique to their region in pattern and colour and were thus, originally at least, easily distinguishable markers of belonging to a specific geographic region. So in this sense then, brightly coloured and detailed, Vyshyvanka have long been a marker of Ukrainian ethnic and cultural identity before the official creation of the Ukrainian state in 1991. In times of national oppression under the Russian Empire and Soviet Union, wearers of the Vyshyvanki were often decried as political dissidents or bourgeois nationalists. Furthermore, the narratives associated with Vyshyvanki are also also inherited links to symbolic expectations and lived experiences of women, reflecting the feminine roots of embroidery and as a traditional pastime. So especially in times of national suffering, the Ukrainian nation has frequently and visually been depicted and imagined as woman or girl clad in Vyshyvanka. Thus, what was once a Ukrainian talisman of family protection has expanded to become a symbol of all that is Ukrainian, and in times of imperial threat, abject anti-Russian sentiment. Consequently, whilst no longer associated with talismanic rights, Vyshyvanka have now become a symbol of Ukrainian survival against all odds. So in this presentation, I wish to analyse not only Vyshyvanka as an object, but its evolution as a symbol of Ukrainian identity. I aim to trace the transformation of what was once an everyday object reflecting the lives of individuals and their families to an international symbol of the suffering endured by Ukrainians, both historically and as a result of the current conflict. I focus in particular on the explosion of images featuring Vyshyvanki circulating since the Euromaidan of 2013-2014, charting differences in how Vyshyvanki have been depicted and used both by Ukrainians and sometimes also those seeking to denigrate or deny the existence of the Ukrainian nation. I argue that this evolution of the symbolism invested in Vyshyvanki is a product of its unique dual inhabitants of the everyday and the extraordinary, which facilitates its attachment to the national imagination. Furthermore, by assessing values associated with Vyshyvanki, I'll also demonstrate the significance of the role of gender in representing the nation. But the concept of dual inhabitants is significant in the context of Ukraine, as it reflects the fact that from February 2022, the daily lives of Ukrainians no longer fall neatly into the category of the everyday. As the Russian invasion brought an onslaught of violence and fear to Ukraine, in the words of Vyshyvanka, the spectacle of the distinctly non-everyday violence became the norm. What better way to make sense of such a blunt new reality than to look to the everyday of the previous generations who faced the same enemy? And one unexpected consequence of Russia's horrific war against Ukraine is that it has ironically provided Ukraine with the opportunity to articulate and amplify its unique identity on a global scale. Sometimes this has meant developing new forms and motifs, as in the example here, using embroidery to depict one of the most famous, triumphant, and symbolic moments of the Ukrainian resistance that captured imaginations around the world. Meanwhile, various characteristics of Vyshyvanka too have enabled the Ukrainian diaspora to remain connected to Ukrainian identity and memory, and to play an important role here in preserving and fostering continuity of Ukrainian cultural heritage across the trials of modern Ukrainian history. To understand these processes, let's first think about how folkcraft can be employed as a tool of nation rebranding and consolidation of national identity, especially in times of crisis. This intersection of folkcraft and nationhood can be both a deliberate political exercise or an expression of cultural identity. To adequately comprehend crafted items like Vyshyvanka, we must consider first the processes of textile making and, by extension, its gendered aspects. It's not only the physicality of folkcraft that lends itself to crafting of the national, but the gendered conception of the peasant woman and the symbolic representations that are carried by her garments. As scholars like Benedict Anderson, Eric Hobsbawm, and Terence Ranger have argued, cultural traditions give legitimacy to the concept of the nation, an entity based on individuals' shared belief in their common continuity. Symbols of folk culture, such as a costume or music, have commonly been used in constructing these narratives of nationhood that reach back supposedly to ancient cultural roots. This process was at its height during the age of Romantic nationalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. So, according to Linda Welters, ethnic dress carries a particular significance within this process of legitimization of the nation, due to an inherent adaptability as a result of its connection to people rather than a specific time period or political ideology. Thus, ethnic dress is a physical manifestation, in Welters' words, of a set of practices created in the past that are deliberately maintained by the group of the present. During the Soviet period, folk costume was instrumentalized for different ends. Simplified and manipulated versions of ethnic dress and folk dances were utilized to help support the fiction about the free brotherhood of Soviet nations. Later, reclaiming traditional folk dress was an important part of the process of fighting for independence and rebuilding identity in post-Soviet states like Ukraine. Now, including during the war, Vyshyvanka have come to be used as a form of protest against Russian imperialism. We can think of this as an example of what scholar Natalia Chaban has called the rebranding of the Ukrainian nation since achieving independence. So these attempts at rebranding have accelerated since the Euromaidan, given the prevalence of new generations of Ukrainians who have never lived under the Soviet Union. With this new generation, Chaban argues, quote, new identities emerge, identities without reference to the Soviet past. And these are fundamental to constructing perceptions of the Ukrainian nation. This rebranding encapsulates the passage of what Chaban calls cultural and ethnocultural knowledge to future generations, both in the homeland and throughout the diaspora. Indeed, the role of the diaspora is linked to anti-imperialism and cultural practices of creating Vyshyvanka, which act as a tie to the Ukrainian homeland. So, as I said earlier, the Vyshyvanka has special connections to gender and to gendered images of the nation. It's often used in imagery depicting the Ukrainian nation as feminine, guided by Berehinia, the Slavic goddess of the hearth, family, and female protectress. The scholar Marian Rubchak has shown Vyshyvanka represents a protective craft that safeguards the legacy of Berehini's family and nation too from patriarchal colonial powers. On this slide, you can see what we might read as a modern-day depiction of one of Berehini's protected, someone that Berehini protects. So the role of women in embroidering Vyshyvanka has often been domestic and consequently private, albeit widespread activity. However, the large-scale wearing of Vyshyvanka at times of dissidence is representative of the mobilization of domestic activity, where it has transformed from an activity of the private, rural sphere into one of the public, and more recently global domain of televised and digitized protest, visibility at displays of nationalism, and also online sales of Vyshyvanka. In addition, the wearing of Vyshyvanka at times of dissidence defines the Ukrainian shared experience as ancient, but also through its link to pagan deities, untouchable and beyond human understanding. It's also important to point out here the fundamental connection that exists in state symbolism between women themselves and the national entity. In traditional patriarchal society, feminine strength comes from the ability to reproduce and rear children, and as a result, women are inherently vulnerable. The nation must, therefore, be protected at all costs, and one must be willing to die for their nation. An assault on state sovereignty is a defilement of her purity, as the use of sexual violence against women in wartime is a direct affront to the strength and purity of the nation and the dignity of its men. The depiction of the Ukrainian woman in Vyshyvanka during an assault on state sovereignty is consequently a twofold representation of the Ukrainian state. The contemporary depictions of Ukrainian women are reminiscent of Kathy Frierson's distinction between the portrayals of Russian peasant woman Baba in the 19th century as virago, Eve, or victim, as she distinguishes. The Baba, she says, almost always appeared as a Janus-like figure, whose utility was tied to her position within the patriarchal family structure. Whilst depictions of the Ukrainian female are different in her context to her Russian counterparts of the 19th century, the tripartite distinction based on moral worth, role within patriarchal familial structure, and extent of agency are common themes, as will be explained. So this said, artistic representations of Ukrainian women in Vyshyvanka are still used to evoke nationalist sentiments on the Euromaidan. In contemporary Ukraine, these images represent emerging the old and new perceptions of femininity. They have agency in addition to the traditional past of Ukraine. In doing so, they hold some of the traditional cyclical meanings of Vyshyvanka as a means of preserving Ukrainian lineage and tradition, and as guarding the legacy of Ukraine by protecting political sovereignty. In this context, Vyshyvanka have not, however, been used as a tool of abstraction of violence, as can occur with state-sanctioned usage of folkloric motifs. Rather, Vyshyvanka has served as a reminder of Ukrainian identity in the face of it. When, in 2014, Ukrainian soldiers were gifted Vyshyvanka by charity to wear in their fight against Russian forces in Crimea, their images were abstractions to the Ukrainian people, being separated from their traditionally domestic context. Now, however, the Ukrainian people are caught in the midst of violence at home, where abstraction for the same scale is not possible. As a result, images shared internationally distinguish support for the Ukrainian people, retaining some of the traditional meanings associated with the wearing of Vyshyvanka as a talisman of protection, albeit with newer national connotations, and as an articulation of Ukrainianness. So the link between folkcraft and the consolidation of national identity established, we can now consider the history of Vyshyvanka as part of a broader Slavic practice of pagan talismanic protection. The wearing of Vyshyvanka, especially in urban areas of Kharkiv and Kyiv from the 19th century, consequently associated the wearer with the Ukrainian land and irrevocably the Ukrainian state. Consequently, in the idealization of the Ukrainian state, peasant folk dress in its various geographical manifestations was the ideal candidate for the 19th century Ukrainian nationalist intelligentsia. Poets such as Taras Shevchenko, Ivan Franko, and academics such as Alina Pachilka were strong supporters of the Ukrainian national movement in the 19th century and were frequently seen wearing Vyshyvanka as part of the daily attire, thereby utilizing Vyshyvanka as an identifiable feature of Ukrainian ethnic culture. These figures have since been remembered as symbols of Ukrainian intellectual life and autonomy, distancing Ukraine from its Russian imperial classification as Little Russia. The practices around the production of Vyshyvanka can be read as a kind of barometer reflecting the changeable nature of the Soviet nationality policies too. By the late 1920s, and under Stalin's reversal of the previous indigenization policies, the folk element of Ukrainian culture was reduced to an expression of tokenistic Soviet realism. The symbolic value of handmade Vyshyvanka was accordingly altered by the harsh material reality of life as a Ukrainian individual, with some attempting to trade their Vyshyvanka for food during the 1932-33 famine. Others would sell their Vyshyvanka in the immediate post-Second World War period in the hopes of affording safe passage outside of the Soviet Union. Vyshyvanka continued to hold a complex position within the nationalist expression throughout the Soviet period. By the 1960s and Khrushchev's cultural thaw, a number of resistance movements employed ethnographic symbols and Vyshyvanka to demonstrate their allegiance to an independent Ukrainian state. Most famous of these groups was the 60ers, who, like previous generations of Ukrainian nationalists in the 19th century and the 1920s, primarily consisted of intellectuals and artists. However, by the declaration of Ukrainian independence from the Soviet Union in August 1991, the extent of cultural suppression under Soviet rule hamstrung the ability of the new Ukrainian leadership to articulate the parameters of a contemporary Ukrainian cultural identity. Officially, Ukraine had won its independence, which Vyshyvanka had symbolized the pursuit of, but in practice, Ukraine's post-independence instability would enable Russian influence in the political management of Ukraine, resulting in a series of nationwide large-scale protests, including the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Euromaidan protests from November 2013 to February 2014. Thus, by the Euromaidan protests and the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, the first overt breach of Ukrainian sovereignty since independence, Ukrainians once again looked to cultural heritage of resistance through Vyshyvanka. While the production of Vyshyvanka in independent Ukraine is no longer a domestic pursuit, it is still widely associated with femininity, evident through artistic depictions associated with the role of Berehinia and the manifestation of the Ukrainian nation. As such, the presentation of Vyshyvanka is still largely connected with the feminine, yet as conceptions of femininity change, such as through the loss of dependency on the domestic sphere, the values associated with Vyshyvanka change also. Additionally, the increase in rhetoric post-independence emphasizing the matriarchal nature of Ukrainian culture has arguably been the result of an attempt to distinguish between Ukrainian and Russian cultures. One approach has involved defining Ukrainian nation as spiritually matriarchal and contrasting it to the notion of Russia as more patriarchal and imperial, according to Zhizhenko. In light of the dominant national narratives deployed during the Orange Revolution in 2004, activism carried out by women largely resembled the early forms of the 19th century women's organizations, being dependent on the family as the unit of power in which to exercise resistance against the oppressive state. This is emblematic of Nancy Naples' theory of activist mothering, in which female dissidents refrained from actively participating in protest, instead focusing on supporting male activists by providing them with food, clean clothes, and shelter. By the Euromaidan protests, women were still participating in forms of activist mothering, adopting maternal domestic roles in the Sich on the Maidan. In this way, as Khrushchev has suggested, these protest spaces were regulated by the male protesters. This time, however, there were calls by some to allow women the opportunity to actively participate in the protests. As soon as the protests turned violent, women were forced back into the domestic roles. Those who protested the distinction of activism based on gender, according to Khrushchev, were seen as subverting the main purpose of the protests and undermining the overall goal. It is in this context that these developments in Ukrainian women's roles in protests, the international depictions of Vyshyvanka regained their potency in the consolidation of national narratives. As Ukraine rebrands itself and demonstrates autonomy from Russia, the Vyshyvanka is developed along with representations of Ukrainian women. The figure of the Berehinia as the mythological half-mother is still evident in the 2022 war, as seen by the images on the screen. The figure of the Berehinia as this time, however, the Berehinia functions as an active participant. So as Ukrainians protested contemporary Russian irredentism, a wave of relearning of traditional motifs became more widespread, along with the creation of new embroidery designs to reflect contemporary Ukrainian cultural and political struggles. Vyshyvanka Day, established in 2010, proved to be ever more celebrated by those in Ukraine and in the diaspora, placing less emphasis on the production of Vyshyvanka and instead foregrounding the celebration of wearing a cultural garment as a sartorial expression of contemporary cultural and political values. So whilst the meanings of individual motifs were less well known, the Vyshyvanka more broadly continued to demonstrate dedication to Ukrainian cultural and political autonomy. By the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Ukrainians worldwide had more clearly defined their cultural independence from Russia, which transferred onto political articulation of Ukrainian autonomy and agency. Similarly, Russian forces in Crimea in 2014 recognized the significance of symbols associated with cultural identity. Following the annexation, ethnic and national symbols, including Vyshyvanka, were banned. Expression of Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar language, history, and cultural practices were repressed, and the display of the Ukrainian flag was made punishable by arrests and fines. The extent of cultural repression enabled acts of cultural expression by some to be the most powerful forms of dissidence. One such example that you can see on the screen was the graduating school children of Vyshyvanka Gymnasium No. 5 in 2015. So located in Sevastopol, the gymnasium was named after the famous national poet, known also for wearing her handmade Vyshyvanka, and the daughter of renowned ethnographer mentioned before, Elena Pachilka. In 2015, the graduating class of the gymnasium on their final day collectively dressed in their own Vyshyvanka along with their teachers, and in doing so, they deployed Vyshyvanka as a symbol of dissent against Russian imperialism. The title of the gymnasium itself is also significant here, though, in that its name was not changed after the occupation. From the beginning of the Crimean invasion in 2014, Russian authorities began the systematic renaming and closure of cultural centres. The Museum of Ukrainian Vyshyvanka was closed in February 2015, and the Ukrainian Academic Music Theatre was renamed in a fashion reminiscent of Soviet control, the State Academic Music Theatre. As the closure of the Embroidery Museum demonstrates, Russian authorities were aware of the symbolism inherent in Ukrainian Vyshyvanka, and yet an educational institution named after a national icon escaped efforts of cultural erasure. Potentially, this is due to Vyshyvanka's identity as a woman of the nationalist movement, often overlooked because of her gender and perceived as non-threatening. As Alessa Horomeychuk demonstrated in her discussion of female roles in the dissidents of the Euromaidan, women often hold that transitionary role in large-scale protest, perceived as a protectress and matrons of the revolution rather than revolutionaries themselves. Furthermore, the representation of Vyshyvanka in physical spaces and digitized formats has erupted in times of threat to national sovereignty. Vyshyvanka and depictions thereof incorporate conceptions of Ukraine embodied by a feminine figure close to Vyshyvanka under attack from Russian invasion. Occasionally, she's depicted as Berehinia herself, the embodiment of feminine perceptions, qualities, and power, protectress of the nation. Attacks on the nation-state are often depicted as attacks on the feminine, as is evident in art from the depictions throughout the Maidan. These representations differ from the 2022 invasion. Ukrainian women are depicted occasionally as passive carers of children in the material culture of Ukraine, however, also as agents of their own future. But in contrast, as you can see on the slide, in 2022, Vyshyvanka and weaponry are provided in tandem. The Berehinia with the gun closed in Vyshyvanka, occasionally child in hand and burning rubble in the background. Choose Rachel Dedman's phrasing to refer to the Ukrainian experience. New depictions of Vyshyvanka rendered women's bodies sites of active political agency on their own terms. Vyshyvanka has now become representative of the active life cycle and defense of the Ukrainian state. Thus, digital depictions following the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine have represented women in Vyshyvankan tradition in innovative ways, demonstrating how, in times of dissidence, symbols and associations of Vyshyvanka have been both recycled and reshaped. Through social media platforms, digitized images and photos of women in Vyshyvanka from Ukraine have become disseminated internationally among Ukrainians, members of the Ukrainian diaspora, and their supporters. Images depicting women can largely be divided into three categories: girl, the woman or mother, and intergenerational depictions. They have recurring themes of the female as an active protectress of the Ukrainian state, protectress of life through rebirth or victim. Occasionally, these representations overlap. In addition, the depictions of women as the active protectress in the Russo-Ukrainian War of 2022 demonstrate shifting understandings of female roles within spaces of dissidence. Frequently, in these images, the active protectress is a young woman, or occasionally a girl in traditional Vyshyvanka with elements of military garb. The military elements, sometimes replacements of the traditional dress. For example, the depiction in the middle shows a woman in the traditional Vyshyvanka, but her vina-wreath worn by unmarried women has been substituted by an array of grenades, the ribbons replaced by bandoliers. Alternatively, depictions present her simply in traditional dress but with weaponry. More mythic depictions of Berehinia with a sword rather than a gun. The active protectress is nearly always represented in Vyshyvanka and Minok. The contemporary protectress is therefore pure and undefiled in the traditional sense and remains tied to the traditional family values. The difference in these depictions is her ability to fight with strength for her family, shifting the symbolic value of the feminine nation to an active defender and protectress rather than passive victim. An exception to the traditional unmarried woman as protectress figure is evident in the series of artworks presented here by Natasha Lechenko, shared via Facebook by feminist historian Oksana Kiss. In Lechenko's images of the protectress, she is depicting Ukrainian women as mothers protecting their children or on their own, blood-splattered and injured, but armed, determined, and unrelenting. In these images, traditional Vyshyvanka emerge with contemporary dress and other symbols of the Ukrainian state, such as the flag and the trident. Above each of the 5 images is the name of the city under Russian attack at the time. These images depict women as non-sexualized representation of the protectress of each city. The Tree of Life, too, has remained an important symbol in the depiction of Ukrainian women as the Ukrainian nation in the 2022 Russian invasion. Customarily, a symbol of new life, fertility, and protection in Ukrainian embroidery, with contemporary uses have retained their conventional meanings. Whilst most meanings of the individual Vyshyvanka symbols are no longer remembered, the Tree of Life is more easily identifiable. In such artistic representations, the tree is often represented by the 3-pronged tree or leaf and the stomach of a grown woman or the heart of a girl. Sometimes the woman is identifiably pregnant or holding a child, or at other times it's her ability to reproduce and foster new life that is more subtly depicted by artists. In these depictions, the Tree of Life is absent, but in its place a stalk or of Sanka, the decorated eggs that are painted at Easter. This is a recurrent theme not only in depictions of women, but in the traditional design and function of ethnic dress. The aprons that accompany the Vyshyvanka are occasionally embroidered themselves, traditionally were worn to protect the reproductive region for women in many Slavic countries, according to Welters. In this way, the symbols associated with Vyshyvanka are similar, yet their meanings have adapted with historic contexts. So the creation of International Vyshyvanka Day, widely celebrated in Ukraine, acknowledged the importance that Vyshyvanka holds as a symbol of Ukrainian culture and history. It's celebrated on the 3rd Thursday of May and was first celebrated casually in 2006 by the students from Chernovsky National University, but became an international celebration in 2010. By 2015, it was officially acknowledged through the creation of the Ukrainian-based non-profit organization World Vyshyvanka Day. significant in that it celebrates Ukrainian culture internationally, combining past and present narratives of Ukrainian identity through collective experience and memory. As each day is celebrated, memories are consolidated and reformed annually as they are clarified in their contemporary context by Ukrainians within Ukrainian homeland and diasporic communities globally. More recently, it has also come to symbolize support for Ukraine in the Russo-Ukrainian War by those of non-Ukrainian background, and more broadly support for states with threatened national sovereignty from major international actors. For example, following the beginning of the Euromaidan protests in November 2013 and the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, Vyshyvanka Day held greater gravity than before. The wearing of Vyshyvanka had now become synonymous with the independence of Ukrainian state from Russian interference. It had become so significant in its symbolism of Ukrainian autonomy and agency that in 2015, volunteers donated Vyshyvankas to soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces fighting in the Donbas region in the time for Vyshyvanka Day. Pictured here, members of the 24 battalions that were dressed in Vyshyvanka posed with their rifles and children, occasionally waving Ukrainian flags. After the 2022 Russian invasion, Vyshyvanka Day was used by Ukrainians as a form of protest against the invasion by promoting their cultural and political autonomy. Vyshyvanka Day was adopted by many outside Ukraine, including members of the diaspora, due to its visuality, as wearing a Vyshyvanka can be a form of sartorial and visual expression of visual belonging without necessitating the knowledge of Ukrainian language. Such visual representation enables interaction with culture, heritage, identity, and memory internationally. Internationally, people demonstrated their support for Ukraine by wearing Vyshyvanka as they congregated in Speaker's Corner in London and marched through the streets of Tel Aviv, publicising their support through digital media. These demonstrations were then shared on social media platforms to reach a greater global audience. Additionally, Vyshyvanka Day in 2022 was mobilized by the Taiwanese government through social media to draw parallels between the Taiwanese and Ukrainian experiences as victims of historical colonial struggles under contemporary geopolitical threats from China and Russia, respectively. The Taiwanese government sought to achieve this by releasing its own Vyshyvanka pattern, pictured here on the left. And so they did this in the form of stickers as at their Vyshyvanka picnic under the official statement, Taiwan stands with Ukraine. It also designed its own parallel spelling the names of Ukraine and Taiwan in Ukrainian, in addition to traditional Vyshyvanka symbols of the eternal flame and guiding star, claiming to symbolize bravery, determination, and the unique aspiration to freedom. Another significant project directed by World Vyshyvanka Day is the Born in Vyshyvanka, pictured here too. Under the initiative, every child born in Ukraine on Vyshyvanka Day would receive a Vyshyvanka. In 2022, approximately 500 were distributed to newborns from the day's organisers with the help of the Health Ministry of Ukraine. The multi-language news outlet, The New Voice of Ukraine, aimed at Ukrainians and members of the Ukrainian diaspora, advertised the distribution via their social media platforms, indicating that preference had been given to Ukrainians born in regions closest to the front line. In this instance, the Vyshyvanka is symbolic of two elements. First, the matriarchal role of the state and subversion of traditional familial roles in Vyshyvanka production, and second, the display of the ancient national symbols in area of the greatest threat of Russian aggression, as both protective of Ukrainian nationals and an image of national unity and defiance towards Russian aggression. In the first role, the state adopted the traditional role of mother in the production of Vyshyvanka and in its gifting to the child. While it's no longer symbolic of protection in the traditional sense, as part of the secondary role, Vyshyvanka retains its ability to inspire hope for the perceived ancientness and legitimacy of the Ukrainian state too. Born in Vyshyvanka is also significant in that it pays homage to Ukrainian life cycle tradition through a contemporary medium. According to pre-Christian tradition, when a Ukrainian child was born, they would first be cleaned in the rushnik, the embroidered ceremonial towels used for special occasions and placed in altars. This process ensured that the child's first physical contact was with embroidered familial and spiritual protection. The child would then grow up wearing Vyshyvanka embroidered by their mother until they embroider it themselves if they are female, or until marriage if they're male. When they eventually died, they'd be buried in their Vyshyvanka or lowered into the ground by an elongated rushnik, completing the cycle. The Born in Vyshyvanka project, therefore, pays homage to the initial phase of the cycle of Vyshyvanka Day, ensuring that children born on this day will wear Vyshyvanka in their first hours, modernizing the process through standardization of Vyshyvanka rather than rushnik. The process is further made contemporary by designs included on the Vyshyvanka, while some of them supplied adhered to the traditional motifs, such as the 8-pointed stars and rhomboids and red-black designs. Many diverge from them too. Instead, blue-yellow designed to reflect contemporary Ukrainian flag, or the Ukrainian trident, the official seal of the Ukrainian state. This demonstrates how traditions have been redeveloped to suit contemporary context and reaffirm state sovereignty when under threat by adapting alleged ancient tradition with contemporary symbolism too. The commercialization of Vyshyvanka too and innovative patterns have contributed to the evolution of meanings inherent within them to serve differing purposes to those traditionally ascribed. So while commercialization of Vyshyvanka was not new, processes of globalization and the fall of the Soviet Union expanded opportunities for profit-based exchanges. As people reacted to political instability that directly infringed upon perceptions of their own national and cultural identity, symbols of national allegiance gained popularity. On the commercial level, new generations of the diaspora could more readily participate in their Ukrainianness through profit patriotism. The most pronounced example of contemporary Vyshyvanka in productions of the independently Ukrainian-owned Etnodim, one of their shirts is depicted here. So established in 2008, the company Etnodim began production of their contemporary Vyshyvanka, eventually marketing them internationally as a way of commercializing culture, but also of teaching an international audience of Ukrainian heritage, specifically addressing the Ukrainian diaspora. By 2020, Etnodim launched the campaign, "This is what my Vyshyvanka is about." Campaign's manifesto encouraged Ukrainians to reflect on the meanings behind their Vyshyvanka, from individual experiences to the collective ones. The Vyshyvanka produced as part of this campaign combined traditional symbols of Vyshyvanka with modernized ones to reflect Ukrainian cultural change and contemporary political events. Additionally, it reflects contemporary understanding and memory of Ukrainian history. So their Slovo shirt, which is the one depicted here, pays homage to the Slovo building in Kharkiv, where numerous Ukrainian intellectuals lived from the 1920s. Many of these intellectuals were eventually arrested and killed in the 30s as part of what Lavrenenko later termed the executed Renaissance. The Slovo Vyshyvanka here uses semi-traditional motifs to represent specific individuals, as you can see on the right. They also released a Krim shirt, which depicts semi-traditional floral motifs with the silhouette of the Crimean Peninsula placed at the center. So Etnodim's Vyshyvanka production may be interpreted as a commodification of historical trauma, however, only to a limited extent. Traditional Vyshyvanka are inherently linked to cultural memory and legacy, and as a production of Vyshyvanka is no longer a domestic activity, their commercialization simultaneously entails the preservation of tradition. While commercial success weakens any attempt at creating national belonging, Etnodim has attempted to frame their Vyshyvanka around Ukrainianness, fostering a relationship between historic trauma and present commemoration. On May 19, 2022, Ukrainian journalist Bogdana Navorak posted an image of herself wearing Etnodim's Slovo Vyshyvanka via Twitter. She used the thread to articulate the significance of Ukrainian identity through Vyshyvanka in the contemporary context of the Russian invasion. She reflected the sentiment that prior to 2022, she said, "I felt we are distant enough not to emphasize the Russian repressive machine. Now I see that it must be emphasized because Russia strives to repeat his history." Navorak advertised her perspective through the wearing of the contemporary Vyshyvanka, where she said traditional symbols are filled with contemporary narratives. More iconic than ever, given the shelling of the facade of the Slovo building in Kharkiv by Russian soldiers on March 18, 2022. So finally, the history of Vyshyvanka and its significance to the Ukrainian people is extensive and intertwined with experiences of family, memory, and nationhood. So this talk has attempted to investigate how the meanings associated with it have evolved over time through periods of national repression and emancipation. Ultimately, I've sought to uncover how something that was once a domestic and feminine pursuit have developed internationally into an identifiable symbol of Ukrainianness in the face of Russian neo-imperialism. Overall, the wearing of Vyshyvanka has maintained its core meaning as an expression of Ukrainian cultural identity and political autonomy, despite its asperser's attempts to deny Ukrainian existence. The cultural values associated with wearing and production of Vyshyvanka have changed from their pre-Soviet conception of femininity, sexual purity, domesticity, and familial protection. Whilst these values have altered, they have not completely disappeared, pardon me, having taken on a new life, especially in response to Russia's renewed assault on Ukraine in 2022. In contrast, political values remain largely unchanged in their expression of Ukrainian nationalism, agency, and anti-imperialism. The cultural values associated with Vyshyvanka have been mobilized to act on political ones in pursuit and later maintenance of political autonomy. The adaptation of cultural and political values have been expressed through the changes in production of Vyshyvanka, and they've been maintained by the preservation of artifacts by the diaspora and the sustained efforts of nationalist dissident movements. The Vyshyvanka has now become a symbol of Ukrainianness, of strength, autonomy, and survival against all odds. Thank you very much.